Included government officials, it included students, it included development sector professionals, and a host of knowledge-hungry, public-spirited citizens, as some of them call themselves. I hope many of you are here today to listen to the course faculty reflect on some of the key movers and shakers in the 1 year of TASEP, as we will call it now. And I also know that many of you here have not yet been part of the course, and I hope that this conversation leads you to the course and to the learning that you can get from that. For today's conversation, I'm delighted that we have all three of our course faculty. I'll quickly introduce each one of them for us. Many of us know them very well already as part of the course. Dr. Vijay Kelkar is one of India's most preeminent economists, having been Financial Secretary and Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission of India. He's known as the architect of the goods and services tax in India, and he's held significant positions both in India and other countries in Asia. And he was awarded for his services to the country the Padma Vibhushan in 2011, the country's second highest civilian award. And we at the IIHS are particularly proud of the fact that Dr. Kelkar is a member of our board. So welcome, Dr. Kelkar, to today's conversation. Dr.Ajay Shah is, and I keep looking for a word to add before economist, and the only word that came to me is formidable. To me, Dr. Ajay Shah strikes me as a formidable economist and intellectual. He runs an institution called the XKDR Forum. XKDR expands to cross-disciplinary knowledge data research. It's a nonprofit research institution that focuses on synthesizing knowledge and capabilities from diverse fields to address the great problems of our age, and we know there are quite a few of those. Ajay's focus spans economics, law, and public administration, among others. He writes regularly in the media and voraciously through his Leap blog, and I'm one of the biggest readers of what he puts out there. He's also recently joined hands with writer-journalist Amit Verma for a weekly chat show called Everything is Everything, which discusses a range of eclectic topics. I remember there's probably been 3 episodes or 4 episodes out so far, and it's certainly worth a listen, each one of them. And we have Aromar Revi, or Aro as we call him. He's the founding director of IIHS, India's first prospective national university for research and innovation to address the challenges of urbanization. Aro has been a senior advisor to various ministries of the government of India and has consulted with a wide range of global and national institutions on economic, environmental, and social change at global, regional, and urban scales. He's a leading expert on global environment change, especially climate change adaptation and mitigation, and has been a coordinating lead author of multiple IPCC assessment reports starting from 2014 to now. And he's currently involved in developing India 2050, a dynamic long-range national economy resource demographic model for India. So I'll move on to our webinar. The title of today's webinar is The Art and Science of Economic Policy, a look back, a look ahead. So we're looking back at the year since we launched TASEP. So let's dive right in there. Dr. Kelkar, I'll start with you. So how would you look at some of the key movers, some of the key stories that have happened in the economies over the last 1 year? We're looking forward to some interesting stories, some hits, perhaps some misses as well. So to you, Dr. Kelkar.
Well, Geeta, let me first join you to welcome all our friends who have taken trouble to connect with us. I'm sorry to say, Geeta, that I don't have any good stories to tell you in the last 1 year, as far as policy making is concerned. I mean, there are a number of policies, economic policies, errors were made in terms of both science and art. And I want to give 2 examples of how, unfortunately, they reconfirm the basic thesis which we put on a book, what is the danger for bad policy making. If you recall, 2 years ago, actually 6 years ago, we started nationwide goods and services tax, and the Prime Minister of India quite neatly called it a good and simple tax. It was supposed to really make indirect taxation of ours far simpler and more rational and more production friendly. Unfortunately, what has happened over years, it is now, as one of the observers called it, is really become GST of a different kind. It's become a ghost of sales tax. GST, ghost of sales tax. Because I'll give you an example. Recently, government introduced what they call TCS, tax collected at source. It's a very interesting policy measure. Every time a citizen takes a bank foreign exchange, for every 1 rupee, 20%, 20% is collected by the government as a tax. Now, this is a very peculiar, frankly, tax which made no little sense. And one doesn't know what the objective was. But more interesting thing that it also probably dawned upon this was announced on 1st February this year. For last 5 months, it has been amended 5 times. Instead of abolishing it, it has been amended. So exactly it sort of brings out how policy should not be done. And second, we confirm the only logic of this measure was what we call in our book the administrative state. It was really the empire struck back because GST was supposed to go to simple tax, but the empire stood against the interest of the administrative state. So they bring in an old era of making it complicated, increase transaction costs and increase surveillance of people, and also increase number inefficiencies. This is one example. The other example, which is not as bad, but still I'm sorry to say, it was again opportunity lost, which relates to reforms of our natural gas pricing. In the era of the transition of energy transition, natural gas is emerging as extremely important transition fuel for India to meet our targets in agreed in Paris Convention. So we're hoping that government will improve the incentives, the pricing scheme by which it incentivize production, attract more investments. Instead of that, the new regime continues extremely complicated cost-plus pricing regime, which means it doesn't give any incentive efficiency. Second, it has a very interesting and very, very negative policy measure of what you call old and new gas. The price, I mean, same commodity, as far as consumers consider same gas, it just supplies the calorific value. But it's different prices depending on where you get it, from whom you get it. And third was whether it was produced in deep water or shallow water. So it has created completely disincentivized both consumption and production and new investments. So I'm not very happy still to tell you, Gita, in terms of policy making. It continues to be still assailed by administrative state, and I'm sorry to say, just not understanding basic economic logic of why we have certain policies which should be interested to improve efficiency, investments, and growth. I'll stop at that.
Just a couple of quick responses, sir. First, on the GST, I mean, I see two different kind of aspects in play here. On GST, it seems to be more a challenge with implementation as opposed to the policy per se, as opposed to in the case of gas, where the policy itself seems to be flawed in terms of distinguishing between old gas and new gas. Is that kind of, I mean, because in the course, we keep talking a lot about both just policy making as well as implementation being key challenges and linked to each other, but it seems to be kind of playing out very interestingly here. So
you could be partly right, but only partly. All countries which introduce GST operate for single rate, or at least there are too many rates. I mean, that's one.
Yes, I think the original plan was really single rate.
Self-created problem.
Well,
there's a problem should have been there. Should not be like there. So I think it's not just it's still a bad policy. It's really driven by the officials don't want to lose power. It would have disempowered the tax officials. And that is, I think, I may be unfair to them, but it is my understanding why there is this congenital problem of our policy making. Is really the role of officialdom, or what we call administrative state, unwillingness to be part.
Yeah. So this is interesting because, yeah, so this seems to be kind of a static in a sense, right? In terms of, the need for power and therefore that driving both policy making and implementation. On the other hand, Ajay, if I can kind of jump in to you. So we spoke about, we had this conversation in December last year where we had all of you together in a face-to-face conversation in Delhi. And the theme there was Indian economic policy in a world of radical uncertainty, right? So, what Dr. Kelkar talked about seems to be the statics, the certainties of the challenges with policy making. We discussed a lot around uncertainty in December. And in February 2023, I remember you wrote a piece in the lead blog, which had a title, Uncertainty Has Declined. Right? So, I'm just trying to kind of get you into this discussion around uncertainty, especially the global financial crisis, the war, and the post-COVID impact, etc. So just want to hear from you on those pieces.
So I think there was a period where the world looked unprecedentedly uncertain. We had the pandemic where we got something which had practically never been seen before, or maybe there was something comparable that had been seen in 1917. But in our living experience, we had never seen something like the pandemic. And then layered on top of that, there was this remarkable set of events in fiscal policy and monetary policy in the developed economies. The monetary and fiscal authorities of developed economies put in a giant amount of stimulus to help their population cope with lockdowns. And that was once again an unprecedented terrain. It kicked off an inflation, the first inflation in DMs since the time when all the DMs switched over to inflation targeting, which was in the late 80s. And then finally, we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So when you put all this together, Russia's invasion in Ukraine is the biggest high-intensity war in world history after World War II. Okay, so there have been many wars after World War II. This is the biggest and most intense war since World War II. So when you put all these things together, there was a period of radical uncertainty. And we were all grappling with that trifecta and understanding the pieces of the world about how things will work out. Things have improved in terms of the economic situation. I think by and large, the developed markets have found their feet. They have started pulling back their fiscal stimulus. They have started finding some firm ground for the restoration of price stability, for bringing inflation back to normalcy. And all in all, the Ukraine war has been reasonably well digested. If Russia had won in Ukraine, there would have been incredible levels of uncertainty because then logically Putin would have been invading some other East European countries. Yeah. By and large, Russia has lost on all its strategic objectives in Ukraine. So the danger of much bigger complexities evolving out of that war today is much lower. So for all these reasons, global financial markets have responded by bringing down important measures of uncertainty. And that was what prompted me to write Uncertainty Has Gone Down. So there is one measure that is called the S&P 500 WIX, and the other is called the MOVE. These are measures that are forward-looking measures constructed from derivatives markets that measure the average view of future volatility as seen by financial market traders. And these measures had skyrocketed when first faced with these three classes of problems. But by and large, these measures have come back. So I think in a macroeconomic sense, uncertainty has gone down. The world is a less frightening place. Of course, the bulk of the material of the art and science of economic policy has been about policy risk that is created by the Indian state. And there, Dr. Kelkar was just showing us the example of the month of policy surprises by the Indian state that will leave a lot of private people feeling rattled.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ajay. Aro, from the lens of an academic research institution / think tank, what's your look back at the last 1 year in terms of economic policy in India? I'm particularly keen to hear from you on two angles. One, in the context of the climate crisis and what we're seeing happening now with the flooding up north. How much of that is coming from policy or has to be addressed through policy? And secondly, it's probably the first full post-COVID year. So in terms of disaster, leading to disaster, has that preparedness taught us something? Has that translated into policy, you think?
So, I mean, I pick up from where Ajay left off there. I think the post-COVID response or the recovery is not very clear in India because our data streams are not very good in this. So, there's one set of people who are saying from empirical and on the ground knowledge that we've actually gone back considerably, especially in terms of poverty and potentially in terms of inequality. But markets, like Ajay is saying, are, they're rising to unprecedented heights in some senses. But let me step back from the COVID question. I think the big thing that we didn't sort of see when we started this course last year, the first one I would say is Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine is not only a question of the economic shock it's concerned, it's also, it speaks to the fact that, one of the primary means of dealing with the Ukraine crisis as far as the Western powers are concerned was by imposing economic sanctions. And it's not very clear that those sanctions have worked as well as they would have intended to. So I'm not saying that there's been no stress in some parts of the world, including in Russia, but its impact both there and otherwise has not been quite clear. In some senses, because of how the oil regime has worked itself out, and Vijay is obviously an expert in this space, India has become a remarkably important source for round tripping into other markets. So there's been a readjustment that's taken place around that, and Russia has not done as badly as they thought it would. But what it has done, along with that and the tensions, I think, between the US and China, is that we are now in a fragmented world very clearly in terms of global governance. And while I agree with some of the things that Ajay was saying, I would think in some ways this may be an even more dangerous world because, if Russia is pushed into a corner, then we are potentially on a nuclear threshold. And that is something that's even more unthinkable in some senses, right? Markets have never had to factor this into account. The last time we had this kind of risk was in the 60s, and then we saw that great act of statesmanship between the Soviet Union and the US at that point of time. So that risk is certainly there in the background. Simultaneously with that, and it's just happened just now, it's not as if food prices have not been very critical. Food prices have led to regime change in some countries very close to us, like we've mentioned in December. There's serious challenges in many parts of Africa. And I think the other big trend we're seeing is a massive expansion of indebtedness that we've not seen, I would say, since the 1990s. So in that sense, even in countries in Latin America, Argentina is in deep trouble. Brazil is also coming out of a very difficult circumstance. I think this mixture of political uncertainty and fragmentation and the mobilization of trade blocs on which sort of India is teetering on, in between blocks that are there, is actually going to change things very significantly. And the reason it's important is because of energy prices. We are so sensitive as a country to energy prices, and our inflation is tied to that. So even if, the US, big surprise in some senses, there was this whole discussion about US going into recession, has not completely weighed itself out. There's, some kind of a landing that's there. And China, surprisingly, they've managed to survive over the last 20 years, all kinds of different transitions. But this lockdown has actually impacted them quite severely. And you can see that in both their numbers and their trade statistics. So there is a shift, I think, in that space that's there. And then on top of that, the big surprise, and Ajay has written about this very sharply, is of AI and maybe a lot of the hype that sits around it. You're now finding, multi-trillion-dollar capitalization of companies, not one, but many, right? So that's something else. And I think this has got a lot, it's both got challenge and opportunity as far as India is concerned. So that was on, a very quick view of the macro side of it. On the risk side, what has become very clear is that in spite of the fact that pretty much everybody, and even markets, central banks, have recognized that things like climate are a serious issue, we've had the Convention on Biodiversity finally coming to some kind of a convergence after a long period of time. Basically, no money is flowing. We found, President Macron held that summit in Paris just about a month back, which was meant to end some of this uncertainty. There was a process that started there coming out of Bridgetown with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, etc. That has not gone anywhere. So, there's a big discussion on that space. And frankly, if we're not able to redirect finances, if we're not able to reorganize markets, then whether it's the oil and coal to gas transition or that to renewables, I think we're in some trouble. So I think the interesting thing the government of India is trying to do just now is to really try and establish semiconductor capacity. How far that will go is a question of how the economic policy plays itself out. We made some bold moves in that place, but the world is returning in some ways, I would say, on that space to where it was in the 60s and maybe the 70s. Critical minerals are a very critical issue, right? That's something that we have to think of very clearly. It's not only oil, gas, coal. You can't do renewables without some of these critical minerals. We are quite good on some things, but we're very bad on others. And other countries and other geographies have taken long-term positions in this space. Even though India's known about this. I mean, we thought about the thorium cycle going way back, 50 years ago. But we kind of missed the bus on some of these questions quite clearly. So AI and ML have a great opportunity, but there are some very serious technological challenges that we have. And I think that's where the economic policy is going to play itself out over the next few years.
Yeah, great. So I think you talked about AI and ML, and Ajay has also been kind of reflecting a lot on these. He's written a little bit around the impact of LLM for India. Ajay, I'm just going to come direct this at you. You wrote this recent piece on the impact of LLM for India. And your focus there seemed to be on business benefits in terms of productivity gains, process improvements, labor market gains, and the like. So just wanted to hear your reflections on that from where Aro spoke about. So if there is a huge leap in growth in AI and related technologies, how can that translate from a macro perspective? How can that translate into social benefits, et cetera? And can they actually end up exacerbating inequality, which is one stream of thinking around technology? So just wanted to hear you, Ajay, on that.
The LLMs so far are proving to add limited value to highly skilled people. They are proving to add value to weak people. And I think that's a technology made in heaven for India, where the labor market contains a large number of weak people. So in my optimistic scenario, firms in India will organize themselves, whereby many low-skilled juniors will be able to do a lot of work, where their productivity will go up by using these LLMs. And then they will submit their work for checking and cleaning and fixing by a small number of high-skilled people. And so overall services production in India will become better. And there is no bigger deal for India's future than services exports. All of us have lived around the great Indian services exports revolution for 30 years. And sometimes we all have become a little jaded. We kind of feel, oh, I kept on hearing that story forever. But I want to say that story is alive and well. It is thundering today. It is alive and well today in a sense that the dollar magnitudes today are bigger than ever before. So, intuitively, when you got a doubling from $10 billion to $20 billion, it was a doubling, it was great, but it's only $10 billion. We are now in the range of a doubling going from $250 billion to $500 billion. It is finally hitting its stride into very large quantities that can rock the Indian GDP. So this is a very important field. And so I am very excited about how LLMs can be combined with a large, weak pool of manpower in India, using, of course, enormous process innovation by the firms. But it could be something pretty spectacular for India. I also want to say side by side that there is the IT and services industry in India today, the complex services industry in India today is the biggest industry in India. That you may think of every other industry on your mind. You could think garments, you could think engineering, you could think automobiles, etc. Well, IT and IT-enabled services is bigger than them all. This is the thing that India does. This is India. Okay, so India is a country that makes IT and IT-enabled services. Everything else has proved to work out badly. Similarly, on the export side, the only exports buoyancy is IT and IT-enabled services. And by and large, manufacturing exports has not worked. So our future is tied to IT and IT-enabled services. It is the one thing that we know how to do. It's the one thing that we do well. And so I'm pretty excited about how LLMs actually make it possible to tap a next 10 million, 20 million low-grade workers and turn them into something more useful.
Two follow-ups on this, Ajay, both to you and to Aro. So on the one side, I know the two of you were having this conversation before we started out here, which is in terms of both the quality and the availability of data in the country for a whole range of policy-related issues. Do you think AI LLM can help in addressing some part of that? And the second question to you, Aro, is even on the climate side, while problems are beginning to be acknowledged, there is no money flowing in yet, right? So how is that problem? Is that even kind of something that can be imagined within this frame of AI coming in to help in any way?
So just quickly to respond to the last question, absolutely. I think AI and and sort of deep learning is going to be very critical in trying to sort of reimagine the ecosystem of how we model and test these things. So Ajay and I were just talking about the fact that if you could have climate sort of forecast or information, not only like we have a weather today, but 20 years from now, 15 years from now, people can start making decisions about whether they want to farm in a particular place, whether you want to set up an infrastructure in another particular location, how you could plan and work further. And I think we are within striking distance in at least 3 to 5 years globally. And this is where India's, I think, got a huge role to play, because we are making a big move in the quantum space, which is going to be important in this. We have, like he said just now, a massive potential in the AI ML space to really pick up and run with this. So if you're able to run these processes along with the other information which doesn't exist in some senses, we've almost missed a decade on the census. Fine, that's kind of fundamental stuff that's there. Our economic census doesn't throw up numbers that are very credible. There's no reason why we can't do it. We've had an infrastructure like this for 50 years. And now with crowdsourcing, effectively what will happen is, if people and firms require this information, it becomes possible now to use other ways around this rather than official statistical systems. So, we better catch up, I think, from the public domain. If not, I think a lot of other players are going to come in and start filling the space, because without the data, none of this stuff is going to work. Fine.
Yeah.
This sits on the availability of credible data, and risk data, for example, is very crucial, because as soon as you're able to get risk data going, you can start getting microinsurance organized. The big issue in the microinsurance space is people are, they have no collateral. Fine. But if you actually knew what their risk exposure was like, what their creditworthiness was like because of other things, you can actually transform that space, which means you take, investments, you take financial inclusion into another direction altogether. So I certainly, very much echo what you're saying. Great opportunity. In fact, I would say, apart from the export story, the ability to bring AI and ML to allow people who speak multiple languages to connect with each other, right? Because we're still in oral culture in that sense. And that flowing back into whatever small-scale manufacturing, price discovery, market discovery in the so-called national market that, Vijay was trying to build many years ago, where there's free flow of goods and services across that. I think domestically, this could make a big difference. So the outside stuff is great, but if you're able to change stuff in agriculture, in different forms of manufacturing, or even the management of electric power systems, which are decentralized now. You move from gigawatt scale renewable units to having, hundreds of millions of consumers who are connected into a grid that hopefully works and provides rooftop power. That gives you real opportunities to create new kinds of jobs, new kind of economic opportunities.
Ajay, any reflections further on that?
So for all of you who have been part of the art and science of economic policy, you will see all three of us around a certain principle and philosophy that there is such a thing as state capability, there is such a thing as state capacity. It has to do with processes, it has to do with incentives, it has to do with checks and balances. And we should not excoriate the Indian government's statistical system a little too much, because it's a part of the package that is called underdevelopment. So when there is underdevelopment, everything works badly. The police work badly, the courts work badly, the statistics work badly, the monetary policy works badly. So it's just a part of that overall aspects of being a low-income, less developed country. So the statistics are also quite poor. And that is a barrier, that is a bottleneck for all kinds of research and analysis and planning and problem solving. I have personally been very excited about the new opportunities that are presenting themselves by new kinds of data sets. So as Aro was mentioning, there is better data in the hands of Google and Facebook about the mobility of people in India at the time of the pandemic than in the hands of any government agency. So all kinds of private data gathering has started happening. And that's great. More and more of that, we hope, will come out into the public domain, either paid or free. And another big frontier is satellite imagery, that when there is a bird in the sky that takes pictures of the world, then it is not mediated by the difficulties of institutional capacity in India. And so we get to see things nicely. So we've got to recognize the difficulties of our landscape, and then we should keep banging our head on that wall and trying to find ways to make progress on the data.
Dr. Kelkar, I'm just kind of going back to what you started off with in terms of GST. And one of the challenges you spoke about was also power seeking as one of the reasons perhaps that GST implementation has not been as smooth as it could have been. Do you fancy not just AI, but technology in the larger context being able to kind of guide or help address some of those challenges? Or do we think that people and technology are going to be two independent pillars all along?
I think technology will be only enabler, not in terms of, unless there are other preconditions exist. I'll tell you what I have in mind. For instance, our institutions, if they are not improved upon, technology is not going to make much difference. For instance, take our institutions for a country like our multinational, national in the sense of different states. This system will require better functioning institutions, which is, well, I'll give only one example. One institution in my mind is judiciary. The contract enforcement, and if law enforcement takes the present quality is deteriorating, I'm afraid I don't see any hope for leveraging technology for better public good. Second, similar vein I would argue is the institutional capacity to supply local public goods in urban, in other words, the third tier, what we call in India. And that is, I'm sorry to say, has deteriorated. I don't see any improvement. At least I've moved to three major cities of this country, Bangalore, Pune, and Mumbai. All three areas, I don't see any striking improvement in supply of quality of supply of public goods. So what I'm saying that I don't want to sort of be party pooper. There's a great possibility exists in terms of new technologies, but we have to go to the basics of what we argued in our book, are the role of institutions and improvement in institutions. And that I think we should not lose sight of the profound implications they have on our development prospects.
So this is interesting, sir, because in the course, one of the questions we raised for participants is what is India lagging behind in terms of institutional frameworks? Because even though we are a $3 trillion economy, we still seem to be lagging on institutional frameworks. And what are some reasons? So this is something that we probed our participants as part of the course. And one of the course participants, Mr. Tabiso Tukani from South Africa, had responded saying that institutional frameworks need to take full advantage of technological advances. So as opposed to technology driving institutions, institutions need to start adapting, using technology more actively. So Ajay, I was just wondering if there are some creative leaps you can take or some examples you can pick of saying where have institutions taken advantage of technological advances in terms of governance?
In the art and science of economic policy, we offer this idea that there is a 4-part way to measure the complexity of a problem in the world of public policy. It is complicated if it has a lot of transactions. It is complicated if it has a lot of discretion. It is complicated if the stakes are high, and it is complicated if there is opacity. Okay, so then that we should flip that around, and we should think that, okay, how can computer technology help me? And the answer is that when there are a lot of transactions, the sheer machinery and processing complexity that is better done using a computer system can help achieve better state capability. When there is a lot of discretion in the hands of servants, sometimes there can be an automated process where there are rules that are encoded into a computer, and that can help in order to reduce the discretion. And sometimes when there is opacity, a computer system can be used to increase transparency. But I want to emphasize the words sometimes, that this is not a panacea. So as Dr. Kelkar said, fundamentally, I am of the view that there is a human and a political economy journey for us in the developing world to learn how to become healthy republics and prosperous market economies. The computer revolution is a part of that, but it's not make or break. It's neither necessary nor sufficient. I always like to remind everybody in India that the British conquered India without email. Okay, the British got to perfectly functioning common law courts without having a computer. So I am not excited about some of the simple ideas that are being pushed, that let's do computers and suddenly we will magically blow past the difficulties. The difficulties are primarily about human beings. They are about incentive. They're about political economy. And we've got to confront those problems.
Aro, I know we've been discussing a lot about AI and LLMs. We've been talking about them from the perspective of research, from the perspective of academics, etc. But any reflections on how they can help drive or assist institutions in policy making, policy implementation, governance?
No, like Vijay and Ajay have just said just now, most of our most significant bottlenecks sit in the institutional structures, how they're running in the political economy. So, for example, in India's 75th year of independence, we had hoped that we would see at least a small or a significant reboot, as far as what Vijay was talking about, of the relationship between local governments, state governments, and national governments. It was not a very difficult thing to do. Given the current political environment, it required some amendments to make sure the 74th Amendment, which is now 30 plus years old, was actually operationalized by making some things mandatory. And in doing that, you actually will transform the intergovernmental fiscal system, the flow of funds. And we have the infrastructure to do that. Like I was saying, now the digital infrastructure to connect all that stuff up is in place. But if the rules don't allow you to mobilize resources locally and use it locally, even though you have the technology. I mean, cities now, because of all the technology, there are at least a few hundred cities that have decent computer systems to manage their daily accounts and their whatever it is. So if you're not able to link property taxes to the functioning of the city, because whatever it is either doesn't happen or it goes all the way up to the government of India and then it comes back, you have a problem. So you have the technology, but you don't have the mandate, you don't have the structure to make it happen, and you don't have the orientation to make that happen. But having said that, there are some surprises. For example, one thing that did surprise us, that of all states in the country, one of the most sticky problems, of course, is land in India. Fine, UP is the first state to actually set up an equivalent of an urban of a property record system. Fine, and it's a non-trivial task. People don't talk about this, but UP effectively has now property records for pretty much all villages across the country. They still have to bite the bullet as far as urban areas concerned. This is I would say an other class problem in some senses. So, if a state like UP is able to do that, and then you're able to deal with questions which really clog our courts up, because you're able to connect the revenue record with the judicial record, you can start making these changes. Then, then if local courts do what the Supreme Court has now started to do, which is to make their record publicly available, and then you can search it using AR and ML, fine? Because now we are able to start searching visual records, we'll start seeing a huge change in the litigation environment. Of course, I'm looking a few years ahead. You have to have the basic public infrastructure in place. You have to have the mandates in place. You have people who are wanting to do it. And then you can push and pull, and there are questions coming, I think, in the Q&A. You can push and pull as citizens, as firms, as civil society, to build the checks and balances that are required to make the system work. It won't work on its own, fine. It won't work because there are established interests that don't want to be dislodged. There's a momentum in making that happen. There's a reason that things don't work in this country, both structural and otherwise. So I think, those are you've got to change the institutional structure, the incentives, as far as they're concerned. You've got to actually build capacities at a remarkable scale. And Maybe AI enabled will do that for language, fine. But then, financial literacy is another question. Hopefully we'll get to that. At the moment we've got large language models, but you need financial literacy and then analytical capacity to look at all the creative ways that Indians learn how to dodge the system. I mean, we do that, as a culture. That's both a sport and great capacity.
And a vocation in some senses.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just as an extension to that, and I just want to kind of go back to Dr. Kelkar also on this. One of the key things that kind of exploded the world of technology as far as the common man is concerned is the idea of collaboration, is the idea of social interaction through technology, right? So is that something that can perhaps kind of, because there's one conversation we had on the course about citizen involvement in policy design, and some of the course participants, particularly one Ms. Smita Kumar, raised that question. It's important to do citizen participation, but how can it be enabled at scale? How can it make it easy for citizens to participate in policy conversation? So Dr. Kelkar, if you can kind of give us some insights, do you think technology can help that? Can there be a Facebook format through which students interface with institutions in a meaningful manner?
I think the enormous role for technology, use technology, increase participation of all of us in decision making. In terms of open sourcing, in terms of inviting consultation or inputs from the your citizens, is now possible to do it, and it's possible to process them. And I think it will go a long way in improving our policy making. Also complies with the policy. Once it's understood that you were part of making it, even if you suggest of mine may not be acceptable, but at least I have been consulted. I think the likelihood of my complying with it is probably much better than it has come as a diktat from
news of today.
So I do believe that citizen participation will go a long way in improving compliance. I'm talking about taxes, tax system, and it's also, if this administration will listen to them, you can also improve the supply side, supply of services, that so to speak, through the dispute settlement or mechanism can be much better, much improved. For instance, I believe that through technology, the contactless dispute settlement has, I'm told, improved the speed, at least, if not the quality of dispute settlement. So I think technology can play a large, quite important potential.
Ajay, I know you kind of articulated your dislike for simple or simplistic kind of solutions, but do you think there is a possibility with technology or otherwise to kind of, and this is one of the questions that one of the participants have put up as well, Sudrip Dar has asked, how do you bring government, market, and civil society together under a single platform in solving issues of the country? So do you think there are possibilities with or without technology to do that?
The art and science of economic policy emphasizes the whole story of checks and balances. What is most important for society is checks and balances, a process of discovery, not design. So when anybody wants some harmonious, happy land where we will all join hands and solve the problems of the world, I start getting allergic. What we need is a process of contestation where there are many rival views and nobody knows the answer. The world is too complicated. None of us understand the world adequately. And there is a process of disagreement and debate and conflict through which we will bumble towards better solutions. So every now and then we feel this yearning for central planning. And you should just go have a glass of milk and say, we love Nehru and Mahalanobis, but we're not going back there again. And what we need to entrench in society is a process of debate, of disagreement, of conflict. And out of that, good ideas will bubble up. And always and always, the phrase that we should emphasize is that the good society is a process of discovery, not design. Nobody knows the answer. Nobody should be a central planner. We should keep making iterative improvements, incremental improvements on the world, then look back, look at the data, look at the statistics. Did it work? Did it not work? And then cross the river by feeling the storms.
Great. Okay, so I'm just moving to some more of the audience questions. There's a question around inequality. I'm kind of expanding that a little bit, given the severe inequalities in the country, what are some policy frames? What are some roles you see in terms of redistribution that the government should undertake? I know Ajay just talked about not getting the central planner in at all times, but given inequality, do you think that there is a way to address that without central planning?
This is a very tricky question because our response to it just now seems to be, at one end, a whole range of cash transfers and, bailouts, etc. at the short point of time, or increasing subsidies. And we know that becomes very complicated and difficult to manage. So I think this is one space in which there is, like Ajay is saying, a lot of experimentation in various places, certainly in the states, and certain cultures that are built up in some states like Tamil Nadu, etc., where irrespective of political party, you're trying to deal with it. But the evidence is not so clear that they're able to deal with questions of inequality. You're able to deal with questions of band-aid in some senses, but inequality is much more and much
layered than that. Yeah.
Not only that, it's tied to how wealth is created. It's tied to the relationship between financial capital and physical capital and how returns on investment are coming from that. It's related to all the questions that Piketty deals with, and we know that those are stocks that are really they're inelastic as far as India is concerned in terms of changes of ownership. This has been an old issue for 70 or 80 years. In the Constitution, if you look at the debate, one of the first requests in some senses was that Dalits were to get irrigated land, and in return you got education and government jobs. Fine, that gives you an example of where the challenge lies. That's a really tough question. And I don't think we're ready to politically embrace it very, very clearly. The last time that we did it, we landed up in all kinds of complicated issues. This idea of, like Ajay was saying, of a directed path into a particular future. We have a particular place in the Constitution for those legislations that we are not able to touch, and they're ultra stable in some senses. Yeah.
Ajay, a couple of specific questions to your conversation around AI targeting, low quality manpower or lower end of the manpower spectrum. Very direct question: if AI comes in, will not the low quality manpower in India lose their jobs?
So the LLMs are not able to give you a complete, correct, debugged solution. What they're able to do is to get you a good part of the way there in the hands of a novice. So a novice will, left to themselves, be able to do very little. Armed with an LLM, they will be able to get to 70%, 80% of a correct answer. And then you will need highly skilled people to polish it and to finish it. So that should be our mental model, that the kind of people who were unemployable are able to do prompt engineering and become more useful. But the work is not complete. The work is not good in terms of quality assurance. And you will need a crew of seniors who will fix it up. And so there's a very large pool of people who are now employable, while earlier they were unacceptably bad.
I think the challenge, Gita, is that given the proclivity of the Indian state, is we'll turn LLM and AI into a new form of central planning. Because at the first strike of it, you can say, okay, build me a plan for whatever it is, and it comes out as a set of responses, if you got the prompts right, which work very much in the direction of central planning. And it seems, because it's so glib, that you got all the answers right.
Yeah,
so there's a real danger there.
Yeah, so we should go to ChatGPT and say, summarize the views of Aromar Revi on how to solve the problems of climate change in India. Boom, and you'll get a 4,000-word essay. That's what it's good for.
But beyond that, when you ask for the evidence, then it'll invent lots of new evidence which actually has no bearing in the real world.
Yeah.
And that's where the challenge is. I think that's where he's absolutely right about that. That's where the challenge is. At the high level, you get some interesting ideas and heuristics, but to translate that into practice, to deal with the kind of frameworks we're talking about just now, there's a real danger, because we not only fetishize things, but we also create new religions. And in some senses, AI could well become that. especially when it enters into the political discourse. So imagine creative activity on rent seeking along with AI. That's like that's a big industry waiting to be created in India, fine?
Yeah, and also tying back to some of the wicked problems. I know somewhere AI also seems to be addressing the more simplistic problems in a more sophisticated, the manner of sophistry, as it were. But do you think, Aro, that larger challenges like housing, which Anuja Gokhale has asked that question, housing seems to be a wicked problem. How can this be addressed? I know it's a huge question, but do you think AI technologies, etc., coming into play in trying to address problems like these?
So if you break down the housing question, one of the core constraints on the housing question is a land issue, fine?
Yeah.
And this is a really, really sticky problem. And normally, land settlements take decades to sort out. My sense is with creative people, and again, to bring back to something that Vijay had said earlier. So I'll take a ditto and come back in a second. So participative budgeting is something that's been around for about 15 or 20 years, started in Brazil, works in various places. We now have the technical infrastructure to enable that, right? You can actually take 5% of your municipal budget or X, Y, and Z, and you can get people to try and, figure out, like Ajay is saying, what is really useful for that location, because you can geotag, geocode, and do other stuff. The challenge is that you need somebody who has got the political guts to go out and use that as a scaffolding to try and build, their process or, their political party around that. So in the same way, land, which is the underpinnings of housing, needs some people with tremendous political guts and foresight who will put, in a sense, their future on trying to solve that even in small places, right? And that needs to be done both at state level and at the city level, otherwise it doesn't work. It needs both those engagements that are there. So it requires the institutions to manage it. You need people who have, the willingness to go out and try a long and tough experiment, because it's a wicked problem. And you need the underpinning data to make that, and the infrastructure happening. So satellites plus, local data collection that's there, and people care a lot about their land. If somebody's encroached even half an inch on this side or the other, they will be pretty unhappy. You can actually find some interesting solutions around that. Like I said, if UP can actually have a number, which incidentally was based on, I think, on the WTO sort of classification system. The person who did it had worked for some time in Geneva. They adapted that to deal with that problem. So I think, there's huge potential for creativity. The question is, who's going to be more creative than the other? The people who are ensconced in power, the new challengers, the people who have decided that, uncivil society is the way to go.
Ajay, I think thrown the first ball in that angle of creativity is put a little piece in the chat box, which is 100-word on how to solve the problem of climate change in India. So I think that's as simple as it gets. Thank you for that. I think we're getting close to closing out. I just want a couple of closing comments from each one of our panelists today. It's been a great conversation. We've touched, as predictably enough, a lot on AI and technology, which seems to be the buzzwords going around today. But some of the persistent problems of the people side still remain and still need to be addressed in consonance with technology, perhaps. But since we started off by saying, let's look at the year behind and see what are some of the things that happened, I thought it might be nice to close with looking at what is it that we're likely to see, a little bit of crystal gazing over the next 1 year, especially given general elections and a whole lot of things coming up in the next year. So what does your crystal ball kind of tell you? Ajay, you want to go first on this, the futurist that you are?
I'm a little unhappy at the way business cycle conditions deteriorated from early 2022 onwards. At first, in the post-pandemic recovery, there was a beautiful, remarkable recovery in India led by exports. So developed markets used fiscal and monetary policy to strengthen their economies, and all those households turned around and started buying stuff, and that generated demand in India. So Indian macroeconomics was assisted and enabled by developed markets macroeconomic policy. But in February, Putin invaded Ukraine, and in March, the US Fed started raising rates. And after that, there has been a sea change in economic conditions. Roughly speaking, the Indian nominal USD exports growth after that has dropped to zero. Many other business cycle indicators in India are also flashing yellow or flashing red. So it's a pity we are in a more difficult period and we're coming into election season. It's not a time when many people in government will have the bandwidth and the time horizons and the ability to deal with these questions. So I'm a bit unhappy at how this has worked out.
And do you anticipate big decisions coming up in the next 1 year, you think, at a policy level to address any of these challenges?
It is hard. I mean, in fairness, the way the calendar of policymakers works, you really see the end of life for the cabinet and the bureaucratic team coming up, and people just lose the desire to embark on complex long-range projects.
Aro, what do you see coming up?
I see some hard questions, and especially questions around about poverty, questions around inequality, questions around job creation, etc. The issue is whether people will relate that to the economic circumstance that Ajay is talking about, or it will be diverted into other dimensions in some sense. So, you can see that in everyday life, both in terms of forms of inflation and expenditure and stuff like that. There's obviously compression all around. I would imagine because we've got very few months before the final, whatever it is, budget vote on account, etc. will happen. You will see probably a fair amount of resources going into trying to sort of entice people to vote in certain ways versus than other ways. So the question is whether the state of the economy, the real state of people's lives and livelihoods, will be able to relate that to larger processes in play and how the politics will play itself out. That's going to be an interesting story. And I think in this also, we might see a very creative turn like we've seen in the last two elections, in which new technologies may actually mediate some of this process. And that I think may make a lot of our previous experiences quite different from what we may be seeing at the moment. So yeah.
Dr. Kelkar, what is your view of the next one? Yeah,
I think I'm very worried for the following year. I think we're approaching general elections, and where the political economy works, you're going to find race to the bottom in terms of choosing measures and policies which are very short-term benefit in terms of at least seemingly serve equity demands for welfare demands, and not worrying about its long-term implications for the Indian economy. And I do worry that some very, very adventurous proposals will come, and there will be competition to the race to the bottom in terms of policy choices. So I hope that our country as a system keeps its head above this this kind of short-termism and take much more hard-headed path. And I'm sorry to say, but I'm not sorry to say, but I'm sort of don't want to be misunderstood, but really the follow many ideas which are in this book. We sort of need to be restated, asserted, and ensure that they are still on the table, because these are open sesame for bad ideas and rest of the bottom. So that's really my worry here, frankly.
Yeah, I think somber thoughts from all of us, not surprisingly, but I guess the very fact that we looked at economic policy and we said it's the art and the science itself kind of indicated that there are neither clear-cut solutions nor the fact that we can ignore them. We still need to kind of strive towards the solutions, which is the art of it, and try to bring as much data, science, etc., into the solving of it. So I guess every year we have this conversation, we are going to look at a difficult year ahead because many of these problems are really long-term, really complex in nature. But thank you so much. I think it's been a lovely, refreshing conversation, a very open conversation, sharing multiple dimensions. Yes, sir.
Before you sign off,
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think you should also, next time this conference should involve alumni in this conversation.
Yes, sure, sir. Some of them are in the participant group, but I think we can bring
So
them
that,
onto the table as well.
speaker, so we can learn from them also. I mean, it's
Yes.
they
No,
probably
great. We'll do that, sir.
closer to the challenges.
Yeah.
I myself more remote some sense about. I speak about myself. It will be useful to have our alumni can come and share their sort of learning.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think we'll turn the lens around and have them speaking while we sit on the other side and kind of listen to what their thought processes are. Yeah. Brilliant. So thank you so much. And for those of you who've been listening in but have not yet completed the course, the link is in the chat. Go for it. And it's a short course and you can come back and probably be part of our webinars in the future. And panelists, thank you so much. It's been a great evening. And have a good
Thanks
Thank
a
you so
lot.
much.
Bye-bye.